We'll get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alyssa Marquederi, and I am the Deputy Director of the IIP. Thank you all for joining us. Today's panel discussion is about our recently launched Beyond Big Cities initiative. We have heard a lot over the last couple of years about the progressive prosecutor movement. And while that is a huge and positive step in the criminal justice system, it really tends to focus on prosecutors in big metropolitan areas. To be clear, IIP was co-founded by the Manhattan DA's office. Some of our strongest partners and those we've worked with the longest are elected DAs from major cities. We at the IIP are proud of that work, but over the years, we've also identified a need to engage DAs from smaller jurisdictions in discussing alternatives to traditional forms of prosecution, focusing on community safety, and of course, racial justice. So that is why we launched our Beyond Big Cities program last June. And today we're really excited to introduce a few of the group's members. In this panel, our Beyond Big City members are going to be able to describe some of the challenges to criminal justice reform that are unique to smaller jurisdictions and how they have overcome those challenges. So I'd like to now introduce our panelists for the discussion. For time's sake, I'm going to keep their bios very short, but there's a link to each of the bios for the panelists in the chat. First, I'm happy to introduce District Attorney Deborah Gonzalez, who serves the Western Judicial Circuit of Georgia, which includes about 165,000 people. We also have with us Maybelle Romero, who's a law professor at Tulane Law School. Professor Romero previously worked as both a prosecutor and a defense attorney in a very small community in northern Utah. And we're finally joined by Sheriff Chris Donnellan, who is serving his second term as sheriff of Franklin County, Massachusetts. His community encompasses a little over 70,000 people. Unfortunately, DA David Levitt from Utah County is not going to be able to join us today, but we're very excited about this conversation regardless. And without further ado, I'm going to just jump right in. And I'm going to ask you, Maybelle, we should note that Beyond Big Cities, it includes people from non-rural areas. But at the same time, rural prosecution and rural criminal justice has been overlooked for a very long time. So can you describe what you would consider to be a rural region, just to sort of set the parameters of that conversation?
I mean, that's a really interesting and somewhat of a difficult conversation to actually start with. And I don't mean difficult like fraught or anything, but there's no good definition actually of what rural means. And that's something that I think a lot of us who study rural criminal justice have to struggle with a lot. So, if you're looking for a census definition, for example, there really isn't a set standard definition from the census, or from the federal government either. It depends on what agency you might be dealing with. So, if you look at the census definition, it's, they say, well, rural is just not metropolitan. So it's interesting because it defines what rural is in relation to a big city, and that it's like, okay, it's just not a big city. But then you get into these questions of, okay, how do we determine then what a big city is? Are we looking at, density? Are we looking at, population, even if it's spread out over a certain amount of land or something like that? And I think that this is a sort of question that a lot more in the way of, smaller suburbs and rural towns, or at least what I consider rural, have been struggling with when they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we qualify for this grant, for example? How, do we fit this definition or what have you? So my definition is very fluid since I've started studying these issues and writing about them as a legal academic. I've really taken my cue from Lisa Pruitt, who is a longstanding ruralist at UC Davis Law School, where she adopts this sort of wide-ranging definition where it's like, look, every rural community is very different. And I think that's something that we do in the United States oftentimes is sort of stereotype what rural looks like. It's like, okay, it's small, it's all very conservative, it's all very white, and it all looks like this. And that's not necessarily true. But there are, I think, really interesting characteristics that do show up across the board when we're talking about, rural places. A sort of strong knit community, an interdependence, perhaps occasionally a little too much interdependence. Oftentimes when I'm writing about these issues, I do look at more population size because it's just easier for me to deal with. So when I'm writing, I'll make distinctions between, okay, communities that are over if I'm talking about exurbs or something like that, over 100,000 or under 100,000, and I start getting into sort of more specific granulation when it comes to looking at population size after that, like, okay, are you above 50 or below 50? Are you above 20 or below 20? And I kind of try to use those points as sort of, comparison points, for lack of a better way of putting it. But when it comes to saying, okay, this place is rural and this place isn't rural, not even I, who have studied this, or a lot of my, other people who do this as legal academics, necessarily have a good definition. Is what's a real struggle about this. It's sort of like, well, you kind of know it when you see it in a way. And I appreciate a lot of the work that the SMU Decent Criminal Justice Reform Center has been doing in trying to figure out how to define this term. They've come upon, STAR justice, is an acronym that they've started using for like small towns, and, rural places and more indigenous communities as well. So it's interesting to see the way that different organizations and different scholars have really struggled with this and tried to answer this for themselves. I don't have a good and pat answer for everyone. I don't think anyone does at this point. That's what's sort of exciting about this.
Yes, no, I completely agree. I think that's what makes it interesting, is there's no straight answer for it. And there've been different articles that define it in different ways, or talk about the fact that it is defined differently based on what kind of metric you're using. One thing that's interesting about Beyond Big Cities is that the main criteria wasn't the only criteria, but the main criteria was people who are from jurisdictions generally of fewer than 300,000 people. But that, of course, still allows a huge array of diversity in terms of who's represented. So we have Deborah Gonzalez, who's here with us today, in Georgia, but it's not, I wouldn't consider necessarily a tiny rural town. And then we have another DA from a very, very small jurisdiction of 5,000 people, in a very remote part of Minnesota. So there's a huge array that's represented in the group. I wanted to ask both you, Deborah, and Chris, tell us a little bit about your jurisdictions. We've kind of talked about population size, but that's not the only defining feature. And what are some of the big challenges that are facing your communities today?
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, Maybell, for that. I think it's so interesting. Definitions aren't always easy, right? And yet we categorize our jurisdictions under these kinds of labels. And my circuit is made up of 2 different counties, one that is considered much more a suburb and a mini city in and of itself, and the other one which calls itself rural. And I think that's part of the definition when we're trying to get who's rural and who's not, is how that community actually sees itself and identifies itself. And in Georgia, where agriculture is such a big part, there is this equation between agriculture and rural communities. And so I just wanted to put that out as I talk a little bit about my communities. The University of Georgia. And so those are the Bulldogs who just won the national championships. And of course, I've got to call them out because they are in my backyard, right? So you can see the 2 very different kinds of communities that I am actually the DA of. And that in itself presents a challenge, right? When you have such distinct communities that have very particular needs or interests, how do you then try to set policy that's going to be the right policy for the entire circuit? And so what we find is that I, as a progressive prosecutor, somebody who's come in with an idea that I do not want to continue the status quo, but I want to have an approach to justice that is fair, that is much more humane than what we've seen, when I do have a very big part of the population who is not there yet, right? They're just not there from a philosophical point of view, from a political point of view, from as they look at what the criminal justice system needs to do and what its purpose is. So that, to me, is one of the challenges that I face. But there are some basic challenges that, whether you're small, medium, or large, we are seeing these challenges across the board. And those include things like mental illness, like substance abuse, right? Trauma, childhood trauma that we're seeing, adverse trauma effects, and things of that nature. And then what we see is that many of these things are what is causing the increase of criminal behavior So, when we look at if we want to keep our communities safe, we have to go beyond just these statistics of how many crimes we have and what kind of crimes, but look at the causes of what is happening here. Look at the trauma that's actually being acted upon. And so there's a wonderful book that I always like to recommend. It's called Until We Reckon by Daniel Surad. And she talks about this issue, that we need to look at that. So to me, those are some of the challenges that I face in my circuit that I share with so many other circuits and districts.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you for
morning,
that.
good afternoon. Yeah, Franklin County in Western Massachusetts is a little bit of a mix. The largest community is about 17,000 in population. The smallest community is about 170. We have, as I said, 26 towns, but only 7 of them actually have full-time police departments. So it's a little bit diverse. And the challenges we face that I don't think a lot of people in large metropolitan areas would have any grasp of would be like economies of scale. When you're trying to come up with diverse diversion programs or innovative programs, it's always more expensive in a rural area because you don't have economies of scale. Access to healthcare, access to clinical care, access to medically assisted treatment, all these things. When you're talking from the beginning of the criminal justice system, when a district attorney is looking at the possibility of a diversion program or how they're going to prosecute, if you're talking about probation and how they're going to do their work, if you're talking about incarceration and post-release services, all these things are impacted with, do we have access to clinicians? Is there transportation for these folks? If you live 40 miles from the courthouse or from downtown, and you've got to get downtown to the community correction center or for a clinical appointment or for a methadone appointment, and you can't get a bus or you don't have a car, those are huge and impactful things that affect our decisions and our abilities to find alternative and progressive prosecutions and services for these folks to try to make the criminal justice system serve them differently and better.
Thank you both for those answers. Sheriff, you're talking about economies of scale made me want to ask you about the program that you started. It was really innovative. I don't think anybody else had done it, definitely not in Massachusetts and very few in the rest of the country, which was you as sheriff started to offer methadone as treatment to incarcerated people suffering from substance use disorder at your local jail. So can you describe a little bit about the program, how it came about, discuss some takeaways and how it all kind of related to these challenges that you just described?
Sure. I mean, I have a small facility. Our typical daily count is about 275 incarcerated men and women. So that makes me a nice little laboratory for experiments like this. But we started in 2016, we introduced Suboxone to our pretrial unit. And that primarily was because we were seeing a dramatic increase in opioid and heroin addiction. We were seeing ourselves, and plus there was a report by our governor out that one of the most at-risk groups of people to overdose and die were people being released from jail. They literally become drug-seeking missiles, particularly people in our pretrial unit who are only here for a week or two, just long enough to detox, and then the court releases them, and then they're out of control. So we started Suboxone in our pretrial unit to help deal with that, to help deal with the detox. We found it to be very successful and have a huge positive impact on behaviors, on detoxes. So we then began inducing, and then in 2018, we applied for a license to become a methadone provider. Now, there's 2 ways that a sheriff's office or any correctional facility can become a methadone provider. Either contract with an outside vendor or become a licensed provider yourself. Again, being small and rural, we only had 1 vendor in the community, and they had capped out their license of 100 patients. So they couldn't add any of our people to their patient list. So we had no choice if we were going to do this, but to become a licensed provider. And it was difficult. It took us 54 weeks of jumping through hoops with the federal government to finally get our license approved. But I'd like to think that we cleared a path through the woods for other people to follow, because I think anyone following us now will have an easier time doing this. But we have the methadone right here in the facility. Our medical staff is trained to dispense it, and it's part of our daily med pass here now. And in a correctional facility, these things, particularly Suboxone, is viewed as contraband. And the security staff was very skeptical and resistant when we first did this. But it didn't take long before they saw a dramatic improvement in the behavior of the men and women in their custody. A reduction in the number of inmate assaults, a reduction of fights, the reduction in conflicts with staff were dramatic and were visible. And the staff really got on board when they started to see that result.
I'm curious, was there any other sheriff who you were talking to help you through this process who had done it already, or were you the only one who you knew of in the country who was doing this at the time?
I was the crazy first one. Not with Suboxone. I was the first in Massachusetts with Suboxone, and I really felt like I was flying in the fog when I did that, because I was afraid that it wouldn't turn out well.
Right.
But honestly, when you saw the number of people dying of overdoses, we really had nothing to lose. So that's why we dove into that. With the methadone, I don't know of any other. In 2018, I don't know of any other facility that did that.
Right. Thank you. Mabel, I was going to ask you, especially because you've not only worked as a prosecutor, but also as a defense attorney in a small jurisdiction. And then on top of that, you've written extensively about rural justice issues. What are some of the major challenges facing our legal system in smaller and rural regions that maybe haven't been touched on yet?
I mean, I think, this is going to probably be a theme that comes up a few times during our conversation, that oftentimes when we're talking about smaller counties and rural areas, they're frequently dreadfully under-resourced, for lack of a better way of putting it. And when you are in a bigger city or in a more densely populated community, what you see is a better tax base, better funding mechanisms and everything that way. There's recently been a really great book that came out by Jessica Symes out of Massachusetts with regard to some of the issues that she was able to uncover when it came to studying rural areas and exurban areas in Massachusetts, where a lot of the folks and service providers that she was talking to felt that to large extent that their concerns were neglected. When they went to state government asking, hey, we need more resources to do this, they would often get brushed off, or they'd be met with sort of incredulity, like, well, how bad can things possibly be? You live in a small community, it's not that bad. And that was honestly some of the pushback I got back in 2017 when I started writing about these issues from other, more established, criminal legal scholars who are like, well, how bad could this possibly be? I thought, all these communities are essentially like Mayberry or something like that, and nothing bad ever happens and everything's so great. It's like, no, you don't understand, people in rural places have the same types of problems. They might be in a different setting, but the same types of crimes happen. And really getting people to actually understand that in the first place can be really difficult, I think. And then once you have those meager resources, how exactly do you go about doling them out? Is a really difficult challenge to meet. So a lot of what I write about is the ethical considerations that come about that lack of resources, especially when we're talking about prosecutors. Something I've written a lot about is, well, how do we go about funding prosecutor offices? How do we go about hiring prosecutors? And I write about the ethical issues that come up when we hire them on a part-time basis or using a competitive bidding system, and a lot of the sort of economic pressures you're going to feel when you work under a system like that. And I argue that, look, I don't think a prosecutor who's taking a job like that is necessarily going in there being like, bah, I'm going to be unethical and I'm going to do something bad in my job. But they might feel pressure to perhaps, dispense of their caseload a bit more quickly, as quickly as possible, so that maybe they could work on another contract so they can cobble together a living for themselves. That's, I think, a very human thing to have to do, especially if a lot of us are coming out of law school with, student loans or something like that. So I think oftentimes a lot of the sorts of problems that arise aren't necessarily because we've got like nefarious actors, like, well, I'm going to go and practice in this rural place and I'm going to offer, substandard services or something like that. No, I think oftentimes it's because of, this lack of resources. And I'm sure we'll get to talking about this in a little bit, but, I want to make sure when I'm talking about all these challenges, I don't think that necessarily everything in rural criminal justice is all doom and gloom. There are points of hope, and I want to talk about good things too. But you were asked about challenges, and those are probably the biggest ones I can think of. I think oftentimes communities are also so small that sometimes some of our relationships to each other sometimes might be a little too close for comfort, I think, if you're looking at it from like an ethical standpoint. Everyone is, for lack of a better way of putting it, all up in each other's business, and that can create some of its own issues. And I think especially if you are, trying to get back on your feet after having an interaction with the court system, living someplace small can be really hard, and that it's really difficult to remake yourself and reinvent yourself and move on with your life when everybody in town might know who you are, what court involvement you might have had. It may have been plastered all over your local paper because, let's be honest, sometimes there isn't really any other news to be reported. I've seen that in the communities I've practiced in. So I think that those are really unique challenges for people who, are coming out of the court system and are trying to move on with their lives in smaller towns too.
Maybe I was absolutely right about resources. I mean, if there's a great public health initiative or a great substance abuse initiative being pushed by a governor or an elected official, and it can have a huge impact on Boston, on 500,000 people versus 10,000 people in Franklin County, the resources are going to go there. It's just the way it is. The great equalizer for us has been digging through grants that are specific to rural communities, and more of those have been coming out. And so you have to meet some definition, depending on which grant it is, of what a rural community is. But we've been able to pick away at those and get those resources into some of our programs here. That's helped a lot.
Ava, remind me to ask you about all the positives of being in a smaller rural jurisdiction. I don't want to make it all doom and gloom either. So if I don't get there, remind me to circle back there. So on that note, Deborah, I'm going to slightly change the question I had planned on asking you, which is, what is one major change you have implemented or are in the process of implementing that has faced a challenge as a result of being in a smaller jurisdiction? But I'm going to change it to maybe has also been maybe easier because you're in a smaller jurisdiction. And I say that acknowledging that you've only been in office for a year. So that's why I also added or in the process of implementing.
Thank you so much. And you just saw me keep nodding every time Mabel said something because it is so relevant to what the challenges are. And so one of the things that I did make a change pretty quickly as a small office, one of the advantages to me is that I know all my people. I interact with all my people who work with me. In some of the larger jurisdictions, the DA does not necessarily even know everybody who works for them, right? But I was able to handpick the people who are working in my office, which means that I was able to make sure that they believed as I did in terms of criminal justice reform. And so that was a big advantage for me that I was able to do. So I'm able to build this team that I didn't necessarily have to change hearts and minds for, but more or less give them the resources so that they can do their job. But one of the things that I found when I came in was a real disregard and belittlement of juvenile justice and juvenile prosecutors. And in my office, the way it was previously was that it was actually punishment. If you pissed off the DA, you were then sent to be the juvenile prosecutor. And so there was this was that you made that? There was this revolving door, and there was nobody who was really focused on learning the ins and outs and the nuances of what needs to be done. If we say that our standard is in the best interest of the child, we had nobody who really cared to find out what that best interest was, what the kind of services was. So one thing that I was able to implement at the very beginning was I threw out that system and I said, my juvenile prosecutor is to me on equal landing as my trial prosecutors. They are in the whole court and they do all the kinds of crimes that they do in Superior Court. And therefore I wanted to hire somebody just for that position, right? I wasn't going to hire somebody and then maybe put them in there, but this was somebody who was going to be committed. And it took me a while, but I was able to find that perfect person who this is what they want to do for their career. They didn't want to do Superior Court. They had a real commitment to youth and the juvenile system and reforming that. And so being able to do that, right, I was able to get that person in. And so the other thing to me about being a smaller jurisdiction is that we can be adaptable. Something's not working, I can move really quick. The judge wants something, we have to move things around. People have to move around. I don't have paralegals. I don't have legal assistants. I don't have administrative staff for each of my ADAs. They are really to lean into each other. right? And to be able to work together. And if somebody has to, write a memo, we don't stand on protocol of who has what title or who needs, to do this or who has the degree, except for anything legal that the ADA has to do as a lawyer. We all help each other in making sure that the work gets done. And so I think that also gives an appreciation in the office that the ADAs, the investigators, the victim advocates, we all play a role in doing this of justice. And so there's a real understanding of the system, the way that it works. So to me, those are, some advantages. Yes, are we understaffed? One of the most difficult things, and I never thought I was going to come into office and then spend almost 50% of my time on HR, trying to hire the right people, trying to train the people that I have, making sure that they want to stay here. But that has been a challenge too, when as a smaller community, you can't offer the kinds of salaries that larger jurisdictions have. And so we often end up that we'll get newer prosecutors, will invest all this training in them. And then once they're at a certain point, they get poached and go off to that metro city. And you can't blame them as a younger person, as an emerging adult, as a person who's finding their way now that they're out of law school, now that they've got some experience under their belt, that they want to move on. But it's very difficult for the smaller circuits then to find people who have a certain amount of experience and want to stay with us, where we're investing all of these resources, time, money for trainings, and then they go off and I can't offer them something to retain. So one of the things that we've started is a remote working policy, right? And we've seen that that is now an essential component to retain good people, is to give them certain options where they are able to work from home, because as COVID showed, we can many things be able to do things from our home or other places other than their office. There are things that we can't, right? We have to be here for jury trials, grand juries, for meeting with some of the victims, but there are other things that we can use technology and work remote and actually give a better quality of life to the people who are working in a very, very intense and challenging job that we have. So those are just some of the thoughts that came to mind.
I have about 100 follow-up questions, but I'll try to limit it. My first question is, remind us what your staff is like, how many prosecutors you have. I think you said there's no paralegals, but just give us a rundown of your staff size.
So I have about 42 positions, 16 ADAs, and that includes a chief ADA. I have about 10 victim advocates, and right now I have only 5.5 administrative staff, and that's it.
Okay. And compared to, say, Atlanta, I mean, how much do you know approximately how much bigger the staff is?
When I look at Atlanta, they've got 300, 400 attorneys. You're not even talking about who their support staff is. They all have paralegals or legal assistants, and that is something, if somebody's coming from a larger jurisdiction who's used to having these extra people, right, to then come to a smaller jurisdiction and being told, no, you're going to have to do some of this on your own, but we have technology to help you, but you're still, you just can't, tell that person, go make copies for me or go write this letter or brief this. We do liberally use interns. We have the law school of UGA right down the block from us. So that is a big deal. We've got MOUs with the prosecutorial clinic, for example. Mm-hmm. We have an MOU with the School of Social Work, believe it or not. So we have social work interns that we brought in to help us with our victim advocates in that way. And there again, being a smaller office with proximity to a big research university, we were able to build that partnership.
Thank you. Sounds like a lot of creativity to make things happen. Chris, is there anything about your jurisdiction, particularly the fact that it's a relatively small one, that made the implementation of that methadone treatment easier, or maybe any of the other programs that you've implemented as sheriff easier as a result of being in a jurisdiction like yours as opposed to Atlanta or New York?
Yeah, and I think it's personal relationships. When I go back to when I first became sheriff, I went to build a treatment program here And I was very lucky. We found a technical assistance grant called Transition from Jail to Community. And one of the requirements of the grant was that I build a community board to actually work on the implementation of a new program here, which meant I had stakeholders in the community who were working with my jail staff, and it was building, that process built relationships that still last today. In 2014, we were hit hard with the opioid crisis. So the district attorney and I and the Register of Probate Family Court formed an opioid task force in the community. And again, those relationships, healthcare providers, law enforcement officials, business owners, clinical people, all coming together on a weekly basis on how we could all work together to address these issues. So when you build those relationships and you have people's trust, you come out with a big brainy idea and everyone will be like, you know what, if it's his idea, I trust it. I'll get behind it. We'll see how it goes. And I think that can be kind of unique to small communities, building those kinds of coalitions.
Thank you. Before I move on, I wanted to give Maybelle a chance to chime in if she had anything to say, or if anybody else wanted to add anything.
I mean, I was just laughing at Deborah's, anecdote with regard to observing some DAs treating like juvenile work like it was a punishment. I graduated from law school when I was 22. I was very idealistic. I went right into like a small, prosecutor's office. And I think the elected DA was rather baffled with what to do with me, in that, he was like, well, you're more like, it's like you want to be a social worker or something. And he wasn't exactly pleased with the way that I approached the way I did things. And he thought it was a punishment, like, well, I guess I'm going to put you in juvenile court. And I was delighted. That was like the best prosecutorial experience I ever got, being in the juvenile court. And I wanted to echo what, my two co-panelists have said thus far, in that what's really great is when you're small, you are malleable and you can move quickly. And if you've built up relationships, which, at that point when this had happened, I already had with the juvenile court judge, who was also, somewhat more reform minded like I was, it was great, finding myself in a courtroom where, a judge was willing to experiment. So we got, we reinvigorated a project that had been pretty much abandoned, in that we started a juvenile mental health court. It's like, let's just get this going, because we can. And that was, really fantastic. And we brought a sort of interesting, sort of different focus on how we focused on children, what was in their best interest, because of those close relationships. And, actually having built up that trust, like, okay, I trust you. You've been placed here because you were punished, because you care about what happens to people too much, I guess, but that's a good thing. And that's what we need here. So let's figure out what we could do with these kids. So, sometimes those small relationships, sometimes they backfire, like it did with, my boss at the time. But then it ended up rebounding and being really great when I got in the juvenile court, and that I had a judge who was willing to work with me and try things out. So, every time that I feel like we talk about something that's really negative, we can look to something positive and be like, okay, these are the sorts of strengths that we can find when we're talking about our small communities. Because I know that there are, like I was saying earlier, lots of folks out there who sometimes are like, I would never want to practice in a small community or live in a small community. And sometimes I don't think they quite understand what they're missing. And I think that there's a lot that they could actually learn from listening to us, and maybe coming out and seeing how, and I say us because I always think of myself as a rural practitioner. I will never not be a rural practitioner, no matter how long I'm a legal academic. That's just the lens I always bring to this. But, I feel like I wish we could show more really urban-centered attorneys, like, look, this is what life is in these smaller towns. These are the good things and the bad things. But, there's as much that you could learn from us as we could learn from you.
Thank you, Maybelle. It's funny to hear your description of your experience, because I was a prosecutor in New York City, and the positive of being in a big jurisdiction is if you messed up in front of a judge, it didn't matter, because he or she wasn't going to remember you anyway. On the other side, of course, it was hard to form that kind of a strong relationship with a judge that it sounds like that you really had. Maybelle, actually, the next question was for you. In your work, I believe you've made a distinction between progressive and reform-minded prosecutors, and you've written a lot about your views on the so-called progressive prosecutor movement. So maybe you could just tell us about your work and how your views have evolved over time.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up this question, in that, okay, I feel like this is going to be a hot take for everyone, in that the way that I approach this issue of, progressive prosecution is that in a lot of my work, I argue that I don't think that they exist, frankly. I don't like the term. I view it with a great deal of suspicion, in that I think that it has grown so malleable, and so many people have just taken it and run with it, and they say, well, I'm a progressive prosecutor because I follow, Brady, or I don't do anything that's not unconstitutional. I don't do unconstitutional things. I'm like, okay, great. You are doing things that are minimally required of you, but I guess we've gotten so used to prosecutors violating rules that we somehow think that that's progressive. So, I see that there is a use for it, and I understand why people like the term. To some extent, I'm a little bit of a polemicist, and I push against it. I'm like, okay, how do we start reconfiguring in our heads what really is progressive? And that I don't want us to settle for something that, we could improve more, is what I get really worried about. So, I come to this distinction of, okay, I don't really like, this concept of progressive prosecution, especially because, oftentimes the way we think of the job, and a lot of people who say that they're progressive, it's still usually a very backward looking job. It's like, and that's what sort of rubs me the wrong way about it, in that, okay, how is it necessarily progressive when a lot of what we're doing necessarily is just responding and reacting to something that someone has done? So it's also a contradiction in terms in my own head that way. And when I mention that, what I want to do is really get people thinking, well, what can we do to actually make things better in the future? Okay, if she doesn't want us to only just be reacting, then what can we do proactively and actually be progressive about things? And we'll get to discussing that, I think later in the program too, like, okay, what exactly can we be doing to make things actually progressively in the future better. And that's something that I want to have us start taking steps toward. Something else that really worries me too about the term progressive as well is that I just don't think it'll fly in some jurisdictions. I think, if you're in a jurisdiction where it works and it's actually of benefit to you, then that's great. You should, even apart from my theoretical objections, you should go ahead and use it. If that's what's, if that's what people are politically attuned to, great. But I can think of a number of jurisdictions, the one that I practiced in, where if I said, hey, I'm a progressive prosecutor and this is what I'm doing, they'd be like, get out of here. We don't want anyone who's labeling themselves such because it connotes a certain political bent. So I think that, it's important to remember that a lot of these things that we're advocating for, a lot of these changes that we're thinking about, can really be packaged in ways that are, politically, for lack of a better way of putting it, appetizing across the board. And that's something to really be mindful of depending on where you're at, and, something that you've got to be really thinking about and skilled about to try to make these issues work, because you might run into some resistance saying, oh, it's so radical and so progressive or something like that. I know that when I was practicing in Rich County, if I ever used language like that, no thanks. But if I packaged it in by way of saying that it was, fiscally conservative, save the county this much money, and, you saw less recidivism this way or something, then people were willing to listen. So keep that in mind, when you're trying to figure out how to maybe package the way you're talking about these different changes that hopefully you want to make in your offices. But, those are my main objections. But I want to clarify, I do see why practically it has some use. I just want to really try to shift our conception of what exactly that means by sort of engaging in this polemic, I guess.
I think you summed it up really well. I wanted to give the other panelists a chance to respond if they want to.
Well, just to say that, it's about doing what works. And if it works, it should be pursued. And if you start labeling it, then you start, bringing in the politics of it, and people start picking sides. And I think we have the opportunity to be more successful if we don't introduce that into the equation. And we just say, we're going to do what works because it's about public safety.
I want to thank both of the panelists and play devil's advocate. So I do call myself a progressive prosecutor, and I have since I, campaigned. And to me, progressive has some standards, right? Somebody who's doing what they're supposed to do, to me, is not a progressive. Somebody who's looking at how do we prevent, as well as what do we do to have the right intervention and then also recognize that we do still have a role in reentry, right, from record restriction and all of that, and helping people. And so to me, when I look and call myself a progressive prosecutor, one, yes, it absolutely is sending a political message, right? And that's based on my circuit. Are there people who are turned off immediately from anything that I say? Absolutely. But it's also because I have carried that label with me for years. It's not just that I'm a progressive prosecutor. I am a progressive person in the way that I think of things, right? And so I hold it to a much higher standard. But I understand that sometimes the rhetoric may get in the way of being able to achieve some of that. But I also feel that there is a real value in naming things certain ways that is true to trying to get things done the way that we need them done. You know, we have racial disparity in this system. And if we do not call it what it is, it will never be addressed, because we'll just be so polite and we'll want that message to be so perfect that we actually lose some of the force that we have to acknowledge. If you don't name a problem, you cannot create a solution for it. And I know that, you know, for some of my colleagues, they stay away from that. They find that it is a political minefield, or that it might, you know, come to a place where it's then going to affect their budgets or things of that nature. But I also feel that if I did not carry that label, that I would not be true to who I am and the majority of people who elected me from my position and wanting this kind of an approach to justice. But, you know, I hear it from all the sides, and I think every district attorney then has to sort of look at themselves in the mirror and decide, one, do they want the label, and two, what kind of DA are they going to be, whether they take that label or not, you know, whether they progressive, reform-minded, traditional, or just DA, no label at all. I think at the end of the day, you have to look at what are they doing? What are the decisions that they're making? What policies are they putting in place? And what are the outcomes of those decisions? And that, I think, gives people a sense of what that direction of that particular DA office is.
Thank you, Deborah. So it's interesting because one of the first things that Maybell said was, it was about standards, right? That there are people saying, well, I'm a progressive prosecutor because I follow Brady, which is not, following Brady is a legal and ethical requirement. It has nothing to do with whether you're a progressive or not. And then you were just saying in your answer, Deborah, that you believe that there need to be standards. So I know I'm putting you on the spot, Deborah, but maybe you can talk about what you mean by that, by, you know, what is there a litmus test, or is there some kind of, what is the standard for being a true progressive prosecutor?
Me, it's that you are very intentional of the decisions that you're making, and that you are creating a culture of intentionality in your office, right? So, you know, lots of times in DA offices, people want to get through these cases so quickly, and that they're knee-jerk reactions, and that, oh, I've done a case like this, and this is the sentence that it's going to be, and that's it, right? But to create a progressive office is to say, no, we're not going to make those knee-jerk kind of reactions. We're actually going to look at what does this mean. And in my office, what I ask my ADAs is, every decision you make, how does that further justice? Justice for the victim, justice for the defendant, justice for the community. Because one thing that we know is that most of the time the victim and the defendants come from the same community, the same neighborhoods. But also, if that defendant is then incarcerated, 95% of them are going to come back. They're going to be released. And are we preparing the community for them to be back, and the witnesses and the victims and that community, right? And so to me, there is a big responsibility and burden that comes with the decisions that we make in my office. And so I want my people to know what those consequences are, and to think about the consequences before they make those conditions. So to me, you know, those standards mean that you're really going to make sure that you know what it is that you are deciding on, and what those consequences are going to be. And that you can, if, you know, what I tell my people is, I put out a day one memo. These are presumptions in my office, right? If you feel that case has specific factors that need to be taken into account, come and talk to me. right? Because that's part of making that decision, is really looking at the facts and why you're thinking that way. Why do you want to make that decision, so that we make sure that the decisions are being made on facts and the right reasons, and not just because of implicit bias or some knee jerk, or because we're under time constraints and have to deal with the backlog, right? So it's being very, very intentional in what we're doing.
Thank you. Mabel's raising her icon hand, so go ahead.
Sorry, I'm so obnoxious about this topic because I love talking about it, and I love listening to what Deborah has to say about it.
I think it's an important topic too.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm hoping for, that it's like, okay, by asking this question, what does this mean? That, like Deborah was saying, you look in the mirror and you ask yourself, like, who am I? What am I doing every day when I wake up to do this job? It's immensely powerful job that is imbued with so much discretion and with so little review over what you're doing most of the time. So, when I say, I don't necessarily like this term, this is a sort of discussion that I hope to get going in that sense. And I'm really grateful to hear about, Deborah's effort in looking at, okay, how do we actually do this in a more sort of future looking way, for lack of a better way of putting it. I think she said it in a bit more eloquent way than I was able to muster right there. But something that I've been really looking at, and I wish that we'd all take a bit more seriously, that these standards shouldn't just be regarded as aspirational, but that these are something that we should live up to, is that I really like the ABA standards when it comes to the prosecution function. And it talks about the fact that prosecutors should be more forward-looking. They should be creative problem solvers. They should be, thinking of ways to do justice in their greater communities, outside of just trying to get people convicted. So when I read that, I think, okay, what can prosecutors do when it comes to using their influence to affect economic justice, racial justice, environmental justice? These are the sorts of bigger questions that we all should be wrestling with, as prosecutors, former prosecutors and the like, because we know that these are things that influence, why people commit crime in the first place. So I know that I had a few people roll my eyes at a paper that I presented a few years ago at Northwestern at their Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology Symposium, where someone was like, okay, so what to you should be the goal, the ultimate goal of a prosecutor? It's like, well, the ultimate goal of a prosecutor, I think, is to continue to work toward their own obsolescence. What can I do to make my job someday useless? And I know that that's not going to happen. I know that human behavior is never going to be perfect, and there will always be, someone doing something that hurts someone else, and we're always going to have to figure out what to do about that. But I feel like that's at least some sort of guiding principle to try to reach, even if it's entirely aspirational, even if it's something that necessarily can't be reached. But it's like, okay, what can we do to try to make ourselves obsolete, such that we can reach a sort of perfect universe where we don't have to worry about prosecuting crimes anymore? How can we use our influence to finally get there? And I know that's, to some people, that might sound very like pie in the sky, but to some people like me, who was once a very idealistic prosecutor, that was really motivating. Like, okay, what, how do we reach that? So when we're talking about standards, I think that there is a use to aspirational standards, that it can help us try to frame this concept of, well, what do we do when we wake up and look in the mirror? Let's think of this aspirational standard. Who am I in comparison to that? When I'm approaching my practical everyday workload. So, I could talk about standards all day and the ones that we should adopt and everything. I shouldn't. I'll shut up now. But thank you so much for at least giving us the opportunity to debate this and talk about it. I love talking about progressive prosecutors.
No, I appreciate it. I think it's a tension that we've heard a lot in the Beyond Big City group too. So this is great. I wanted to give another question to Chris and then Deborah, and that is, what has been the response from the community about some of the changes you've made? Has there been a huge amount of opposition? Deborah, based on what you said before, my guess is just a little bit of opposition, maybe. But Sheriff, I'm actually not sure about your jurisdiction. So again, whether it's about the methadone treatment program or anything else, what has been the response? Has there been a lot of political pushback, or has it been a relatively easy experience?
It actually has been an easy experience, and I think it's a little bit unusual because we formed an opioid task force in 2014, and as a community, we educated ourselves. We were really wrapped our arms around this notion of addiction as a disease. And together as a community, we erased the stigma. We began looking to solve this problem. And in the context of that, I started to implement these programs. In the absence of that, it probably would have been a lot more difficult. I mean, the pushback that I did get initially was from the abstinence-based recovery community, because those folks, in the AA community, viewed folks on medically assisted treatment as still using, and even probably for a couple of years after we started this program, there was still pushback from that corner of the world. But community as a whole, we educated ourselves, we worked really hard on this issue, and it evolved from that. So the pushback hasn't been great.
It sounds like you did it through, you said we as a community. I mean, how did you, it almost sounds like you did it as a community rather than you, the sheriff, saying, this is what we're going to do. Now let me tell you how we're going to do it. So how did you do that logistically in practice?
Logistically in practice, I was a tyrant. I'm the sheriff. I make the decisions, and this is what we're going to do. Is how it went inside the walls, not quite outside the walls. But again, from the community group that we had that worked with us building our program, we talked to folks before we did it. We got input from people, from experts, from medical experts, from clinical experts. We had to communicate with probation in the courts. We had to communicate with clinicians in the community, because when our guys get released, they're released into their hands. And how do you folks feel if they're coming to you with a prescription for Suboxone? Will probation allow somebody to come back and be supervised in probation if we induce Suboxone in the jail? We had to work all those things out. So all that was done beforehand. And then together we marched forward.
So tyrant behind the scenes, but externally
outside the walls.
Deborah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a very different experience. And part of that is because of who I am. I am a female. I am the first female DA in my circuit ever, the first minority DA in my circuit, the first Latina DA in the entire history of my state, and the first Puerto Rican woman DA in the country. Okay. So when you think about that, being a woman of color, being the first in so many ways, it was making me think. Yesterday, I was in a law enforcement meeting. And when I looked around, every other agency head was male. Their chiefs were male. Their deputies were male. And I was the woman in the room. And so, I have received pushback, not just because of the policy changes that I am implementing, but also because of my gender, also because of my ethnicity and race. I have two counties that are very, very different. In one county, the larger county, thankfully, I am beloved, to the point where they have given me like Wonder Woman sneakers that light up, right? And on the other county, I am getting death threats and being told they're going to shoot me in the head, on social media. And this is just, to me, symbolic of the divide that we have in our country, and some of the very real structural issues that we have with our criminal legal system. When we do say, there is racial disparities in this system, there is gender disparities, there is oppression based on whether people are Black, poor, brown, women, trans, etc. And these are all truths that I live with every day as I sit in this seat as district attorney, and things that, if we want change, right? I don't look like a traditional DA. Alyssa has met me. I am 4'10.5". Okay, so
I was surprised. I was surprised
at how short I am, but I don't look the part of what people think of as law enforcement and as a district attorney, but that also, because of that, I can bring some advantages, right? I have a different approach. I'm not going to tower over you. In fact, I'm going to speak quite low, that if you keep yelling, you are not going to hear me, and we are not going to have a conversation. And so there are times that I will use that, the fact that I can speak another language, that I can speak Spanish and be able to speak to people in my community who have long been considered ignored by the system, to be able to speak in their native language and educate, because I think that is the other big part that we need to do as heads of these agencies. We need to educate the public. Most people don't know what a DA does. They don't know the intricacies of the court system. Most of them don't want to know, right? They just, it's negative. They don't want to know, but they don't realize how much our decisions actually affect their everyday lives. And so to be able to communicate with them in their language in a way that they can understand, to me, is a very, very big deal.
Well, Deborah, you definitely broke a lot of ceilings. I think I knew all of those, except I did not know first Puerto Rican female DA in the country. So that's huge. So very belated congratulations, but that's fantastic. I want to be mindful of the time since our panelists are very busy people. We've got 4 minutes. We'll do a quick lightning round. The question is, what are some first steps for prosecutors or law enforcement in smaller jurisdictions who want to challenge and change longstanding policies? Put another way, what are some changes that you think every prosecutor's office, or for Chris, every sheriff's office or police department, regardless of size and regardless of resources, what are some changes that they can make right now? So I'll start from my top left corner, which is Mabel, and then we'll go to Deborah and Chris.
I mean, I think like Deborah was saying even earlier, and I've mentioned this already before, I think really just being intentional about everything that you do. Waking up, asking, okay, what am I doing? What are my goals? What is my office trying to accomplish? And I think, if you're small enough, my office that I worked in, it was 7 attorneys, so we were able to meet a lot and, discuss what we were trying to accomplish and what our policies were and fight it out, sometimes because we didn't all agree. But that was actually possible. So just being very intentional about what you do. And I'm grateful also to hear discussions about this. It might not be something that happens immediately right now that you can change, but when you're thinking about who to hire in future, consider hiring more diverse attorneys, and actually making that a priority. I was the first Latino woman who worked in 4 counties, and people to some extent somewhat similarly, a lot of people didn't even believe I was an attorney the first time I showed up to work. And then I'd hear from other folks in the community that they're like, yeah, you're in the prosecutor's office, but it means a lot to us to actually see ourselves represented in that office. Even it feels like, perhaps that you care more about our own community concerns as well. Getting back to the point that not all rural places are, all, monolithically white or anything like that. So I think, trying to figure out what you can do for your minority communities and who doesn't have representation in your office is something really to consider more of.
So I'm gonna suggest 2 things. One is, if this is something that you're thinking about, reach out to other DAs. I've reached out to a number of DAs throughout the country, and they've been so generous with their time and to answer questions for me. And it's been so helpful and created wonderful friendships now. But it's also great, they always say being at the top is lonely, right? Because you're the one who ends up having to make those decisions and the burden is on you. So finding a network of like-minded people who can help you, and even some people who can sort of serve as the devil's advocate, right? Who can give you the counterpoint to what it is that you're doing, I think is very important. The other thing I would say, get out of the office, go meet the community, go visit the jails, go to the public defender's office, go to all sorts of meetings and community events. Get out there, understand how those decisions that you make then affect your community firsthand. Speak with people with lived experiences, right? I've gone to a number of reentry meetings to hear them, because how they end up leaving the system a lot of time depends on how my office puts them in that system to begin with. So being able to see both sides and take some of my ADAs as well so that they can see that and the consequences. So, learn what you can, reach out to other DAs, and then get out of the office to the community.
I would say don't be afraid to do what you know will work. When I became sheriff, the policy here was containment, and nothing else was done. We built a cognitive behavioral trauma-informed therapy program here. A lot of people told me I was being touchy-feely, but it works. We did the medically assisted treatment program because it works. When I first ran for sheriff of a county like Franklin and to run a county jail, what I said over and over again is no one at the Franklin County House of Correction who's serving a life sentence. Every one of these people is coming back to our community. Our job is to make them better citizens, better family members, and to reduce recidivism. And the bottom line is that's what we're going to be judged on, reducing recidivism. So do what you know works to get to that goal.
I think this is all fantastic advice. Somehow you all managed to cram in a ton of good information in 3 minutes, so I appreciate it. I just want to thank our panelists so much for doing this. Both of you have dedicated so much of your time, both to the Beyond Big City program, and in general, the IIP and this event. So huge thank you to all three of you. Thank you to our attendees, our audience for watching today. If you have any questions specific to the panelists or to us at the IIP, please email me. Our email addresses are on our website. But thanks again to all three of you for making the time today. This was fantastic.
Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.